Welcome back to another edition of the Economics of Our Times. My name is Wayne Williams. I'm an assistant professor of finance here in the Business Administration Department at the Community College of Philadelphia. Today's lecture is titled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I have come to you with a series of short lectures since the near economic collapse of our U.S. economy in the year 2007 and 2008. We've covered some interesting topics. We've talked about the crisis, the financial crisis that occurred here in the economy. We've talked about unemployment. We've talked about healthcare. And we've talked about just the general mechanics of how our economy works. Today, what I'd like to do is give you an update of where we are in the economy, what has happened since the initial financial crisis, and what is the forecast for the future of our economy. So, we are going to look at some of the good things that have happened in our economy, the bad that has happened in our economy, and the ugly things that may be happening and confronting our economy as we move forward. So I titled the lecture after the 1966 Western classic that starred Clint Eastwood, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And so we're going to look at what has happened to our economy up until today. Right now, there are some positive signs that show that our economy is recovering. We're going to look at the major economic indicators, one of which is gross domestic product. You may recall that I spoke about gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is actually comprised of four factors. There is consumption. When consumers spend in the economy, that drives economic stimulus for the economy and creates jobs. So consumer spending is one component of GDP. That's good for our economy. We have had pretty robust consumer spending, including what looks like a return of the housing market. There's some strong signs in the housing market. Housing sales have picked up, and there's even been some rebuilding. Those are good economic signs. The second component of GDP is investment by businesses. Investment by businesses is normally formed in the economy by the purchase of capital. So capital comes in the form of equipment. So when manufacturing is done, businesses go out and purchase that equipment in order to manufacture goods. That translates into more job orders, more manufacturing orders, and more job creation. That's another component of GDP. Usually in a recovery, the investments by business goes up. Unfortunately, in this recovery, we haven't seen the same robust investment by businesses, and so our economy has not been recovering at a very fast rate. The third element of GDP is government spending. And one factor that is true is that government spending has been on the rise. And so while government spending is good for the economic growth of our economy, it has some bad in it as well. One of the bad elements of our government spending is it creates a government deficit. We're going to talk about that just a little bit later. So the fourth component of our economy or GDP is net exports. And so what we do is we take the amount of goods that we export and we subtract the amount of goods that we import. We've had for probably the last 3.5 decades or more a negative net exports computation in GDP. And so what this does is it actually is a drag in our economy. The fact that we import more than we export actually translates into a lower GDP, and so our economy grows slower. As we talk now, our GDP is between 2 and 3%. In the past, we've been about 3% or better. And so as we look at an economic recovery, GDP generally picks up when we come from a downturn. We went into a downturn at the Great Recession, and that happened in about 2008 and 2009. Since about 2009 in the fourth quarter, all the way up until today, we have had positive GDP in each of the subsequent quarters. The exception would be the first quarter of 2011, we had negative GDP. But unfortunately, the pace of growth has not been what we would call ideal. So while we have positive growth, the bad in it is that the growth has not been as fast as we would like for it to be in order for our economy to recover and stabilize. So what does this mean to you? One way that you could see GDP show up in your life would be in employment. Employment opportunities is created in unemployment. And so unemployment figures have actually been going down. But I'm going to show you a graph to try to explain to you what is happening with unemployment. So let's look at this graph that depicts what has happened to unemployment figures here in the United States. So if we look at the unemployment figures, these unemployment figures are showing a graph. If you look on the vertical axis, you'll see that it goes from 4 to 12. That is the percentage of unemployment. The period of time shown is from 2003 through about midway through 2012. And so you'll see that 6% was the rate of unemployment in about 2003, and it went down as low as close to 4% in the middle of 2006. What you see then is a steep rise in the unemployment rate that goes from 2006 and peaks in the first quarter of 2009, where we had double-digit unemployment rate. And so you're looking at not two lines on this graph. The top line, which shows the participation rate, is higher than the actual rate of unemployment. So when unemployment reached 10%, the participation rate was actually 12%. So we need to explain that. You'll see that the graphs are starting to spread further and further apart, even though unemployment rate, the actual rate, is declining and is below 8% in 2013. The participation rate that's shown is still up between 11 and 12%. So what this means is that even though we have added jobs to our economy, the number of persons who participate in the economy has started to dwindle. So those people who were employed that became unemployed once we had the recession went to seek jobs. And when they did not find jobs, they became what is called a discouraged worker. When a discouraged worker no longer looks actively for employment, they are taken out of the rate of unemployment. So even though the unemployment rate is dropping, as you can see, over time, what you see is the participation rate has not actually declined along with it. So that means that the unemployment rate is down, but there are more people out of work because they stopped actively seeking employment in the market. That's the bad. So the good is a lower unemployment rate. The bad is there are more discouraged workers in our environment. So the economy is showing this as a bad signal, even though it's a positive sign in the economy. Let's look at that spending that we talked about in GDP. So I'm going to show you another graph. This graph looks at the deficit. So in the deficit, what we see is that there is two measures that we have to take into consideration. The first measure looks at how much receipts the government actually takes in. So when we think about how much the government takes in, we think about the amount of dollars that are collected in the form of taxes. The second figure actually shows how much we actually spend, and that's considered to be an outlay. Okay, great. This graph is shown to you, and it's provided by the Congressional Budget Office. Congressional Budget Office is responsible for actually managing the budget of the federal government. So as you can see, there's a dark line at the bottom starting in 1973 with a lighter line above it. And you'll actually see that the lighter line is generally above the darker line. The darker line represents the receipts that are taken in by government. So as we pay our taxes, whether it comes from private individuals like you or I, or whether corporations pay taxes, we call those receipts for the government. And so when receipts are greater than the amount of spending, we have what's called a budget surplus. What you see is that generally our government operates at a deficit. They actually spend more money than they take in. When the two lines in the graph are further apart, that actually is a bad signal in our economy. So you can look and see that in 2009, that is the period where the two lines were the furthest apart. That means that the actual outlays or government spending was far greater than the amount of revenue that it took in from taxes. Now, there are a couple reasons why this happened. Number one, there was a significant rise in unemployment. I just showed you that. So we got up to double-digit unemployment. That means that there are less people working, which means there are less people paying in taxes. At the same time this happened, in order for us to stimulate the economy, what the government did was it borrowed money, and it actually did the bank bailout. Remember, we talked about that a few of our lectures ago. So the bank bailout plus the unemployment rate, that is the reason why you see such a large divergence in the two graph lines. So literally, if we look at those two lines, we'll see they spread in about 2009, and then they started to actually come together in about 2012. Well, that's a good sign. What that means is that the actual deficit is starting to narrow. We would like to see that deficit narrow, because what happens over time is that the economy starts to accumulate that deficit, and you hear about that in the news quite often. Right now, our total GDP for the U.S. economy is about $16 trillion. At the same time, our total deficit accumulated in our federal government is about $16 trillion as well. So that would be similar to a person who made $100,000 actually owing $100,000. As much activity as we're able to generate in our economy is equal to about the same amount that we owe back out as debt. That's not good for the economy. So while it's good that we're narrowing the deficit, what is actually bad is that we've accumulated a tremendous amount of debt that is going to be passed on, and we're going to have to service that debt in the future. Now, to close this deficit, there are two things that need to happen. Either they happen together or they happen one or the other. And so one of the things that we could do is we could increase the amount of taxes that we collect, and that way we would increase the number of receipts. That would narrow the gap between the two lines so that the spending would be caught up by the amount of receipts that we collect from the government. But as you know, increases in taxes are just generally not a happy thing for most people in the economy. So there's not a lot of support for increasing taxes. On the other hand, what we can think about is what happens if we cut spending. So the issue of cutting spending is another way for us to actually reduce that deficit. So even if we don't increase taxes, but we reduce our deficit, our spending, we can still narrow the actual overall deficit in each of the annual budget years for the U.S. government. At the time, what we're doing is we're kind of debating which direction we're going to take. Now, President Obama has introduced what he calls a balanced approach. This balanced approach says we're going to have some tax increases as well as some government spending. And if we do both of them simultaneously, this would achieve the third way to reduce the deficit, which is by increasing taxes and reducing spending. Because Congress has been embroiled in some gridlock, we have not come to a resolution, and unfortunately, that would be bad. And so, although we are narrowing the deficit, it is not because there is agreement on the best way in order for us to do this. This concept is known as something called sequestration, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. I'd like to share with you one more graph that I think is very important. Let's take a look at this one. This is our GDP. I'm going to go back and take a look at what has happened to the overall growth in our economy, so it gives you kind of a perspective. A picture's worth 1,000 words. So if you look, it shows in January of 2009, we actually had a negative 5.3% drop in GDP. That is what we termed as the Great Recession. It was the net effect of multiple quarters of repeated negative GDP. And so that drop is very significant. We had never seen a drop in our GDP like that, with the exception of the Great Depression, which happened in the 1930s. You'll see then again in the next quarter, going into the second quarter of 2009, we were still in the negative, but we were able to turn positive in the third quarter of 2009. You'll see that from that point forward, we were positive in each of the subsequent quarters, going all the way up and through June of 2012. So showing that 1.5% is about one of the latest GDP figures that we have. We're actually about the same now in the most recent quarter. So although historically we have been about 3%, we're only clicking along at about between 1 and 2%. And what we'd like to see in a recovery is that the GDP would actually pick up significantly higher and then come down and stabilize at about 3%. So there's some real concern about how we're going to move our GDP and keep it very positive. So if you look at the GDP graph, what you see is kind of a roller coaster ride. Although we had some good quarters, it's actually come down, going back up, and on average we've been about slightly less than 2%. We'd like to see that increase by at least 1%, but most economists forecast that by the end of the year, we probably will result in 2013 with a GDP of less than 2%. So while it's good that we're positive, what's bad is that the rate of this growth in our economy through GDP is not where we'd like for it to be. So what are some of the things that we could do? Some of the things that we could do in order to stimulate the economy would be to create more jobs. And as we looked in the unemployment figures, we are creating more jobs and the unemployment rate is dropping, but there are a lot of discouraged workers. So there are some reasons why the participation rate has declined. In 1946, it was the beginning of the baby boomer generation. And so by 2011, the first baby boomers started to retire or reach age 65 and become eligible for Social Security. Some of these persons then dropped out of the labor market, and so there's an opportunity when they actually come out of the labor market for younger workers who are coming into the labor market to go out and find jobs. Unfortunately, many of them did not retire. If your retirement account was down because of the collapse that happened in 2008, you were less likely to be a retiree who would leave the workforce, and so therefore a job was not created by those leaving the workforce. What that means is that even though we increased the number of college graduates, we did not increase the number of job opportunities. There is some argument over whether or not the skill set is another challenge for us when we think about the number of jobs that are created. So most of the jobs that are going to be created, according to the Bureau of Labor standards, says that you're going to need post-secondary education in order to fulfill those jobs. So most of the jobs that are going to be created in the next decade are going to require at least an associate's degree. But unemployment for those who did not have an associate's degree was highest. So where we saw the lowest levels of unemployment were in those workers who were between the age of 45 and the age of 54, and those workers who had bachelor's degree or higher. These workers had unemployment throughout the recession of about 5%. If you were a teenager or you did not have post-secondary degree or some other credential, your unemployment rate was probably somewhere between 12 and 17%, which is historically high. And so jobs are not being created for those who have the least education and then for our younger workers. This is a bad sign, despite the fact that we have a good sign that unemployment is dropping. So it becomes a concern for the economy moving forward. How do we create jobs for younger workers and still have a comfortable retirement for our older workers who still remain in the workforce? This shows up in our unemployment figures and becomes a drag on our economy. So even though our GDP goes up, it doesn't mean that our economy is growing at the rate that it could, because we're holding off one of the factors of production, which is the number of labor workers we have in the economy. What we like to do is see more people get out and get back to work. This is where business comes in. The business investment has not been what we would traditionally see in a period of recovery. And although corporate profits have actually been at historic highs, which we see show up in the stock market, we have not seen the creation of jobs at the rate that we'd like to see by businesses in the market. There are a number of factors for that. There is some uncertainty in the market as we've been engaged with foreign policy. There is some jobs that have been shipped overseas, which means that the businesses are not encouraged to create jobs here at home and are thinking that they're creating jobs overseas. And so global competition is also another issue. So while we have educational concerns that deal with skills for younger workers, businesses are concerned about their ability to draw profits while being profitable here by hiring workers here in the United States who generally ask for higher wages versus the wages of labor that they can get overseas. We see some good signs in terms of the automobile industry, and we've talked about that. The automobile industry has retooled. We're seeing more and more American cars on the road. These cars have greater fuel efficiency, which we are switching our fuel dependency. We're using more natural gas. We are also using the fracking, which is creating that natural gas. We are using more domestic oil production, and we're also using some smart energy, including wind energy. And so all of these things are good signs, which means that we will become less and less dependent on oil from foreign countries, such as in the Middle East. As we know, the Middle East tends to be contentious, and we've had some very expensive wars, which have also contributed to our deficit. So we're entering the fall, and we have a budget period where the president has proposed a budget for 2014. And Congress has to do the heavy lifting of looking at that budget and coming to some resolution to say whether or not they're going to pass the president's budget. That normally happens in October 1st of every calendar year. And so Congress will get together and come to some resolution and generally pass the budget. But here's where everything turns ugly. We haven't had a budget that has passed since 2010. So, this issue of not passing the budget has been something that has been created called sequester. Sequester is a concept that actually is a legal term. It dates back quite a ways, and what it really means is that a court would take over agency of property, and when two parties were involved in a dispute, they would take possession of the property while the two parties disputed and came to some sort of resolution. The reason that the court would possess the property is so that the two parties who possess that property would not abuse it, nor would they neglect that property, so that when the resolution was actually made, the two parties would not would be able to use the property in the form before they went into the dispute. Well, in about 1985, there was a legislative act that created the term sequester that's used in the budgeting process. And we've used it that way since when we look at economics. Right now, we've actually are experiencing a sequester. And what that means is those are automatic cuts that happen in the economy. So I'm going to show you what sequester looks like through this PowerPoint slide. As you can see, sequestration is defined as automatic across-the-board cuts on federal domestic and defense discretionary and mandatory funds beginning with January 2nd, 2013. What this means is that automatically, as of January 2nd, the Treasury Department no longer funded those agencies in the federal government that were appropriated in the budget, because the sequestration cuts meant that they would not pass along the funds that were not agreed upon by Congress. So what happens is there is theoretically across the board cuts, meaning that about an 8.2% cut in every federal agency would occur. But if that were to happen, that would mean it would be a risk for our national defense. There would be some people who would not receive their Social Security. There would be some programs that would not be funded, and our poor and our young folks would be vulnerable. So there were some exemptions that were enacted. So the sequestration goal was to actually cut $1.2 trillion of deficit over a period of decade going from 2013 through 2021. That would equate to $109 billion of cuts in order to shrink that deficit gap. So there were some things that were exempted from being cut. Things like transportation, trust funds like Social Security, the CHIP program, which is health insurance for those individuals who are disabled or in lower income, Medicaid and Medicare has been capped to at least a 2% cut, not that 8.2% cut that I described. Veterans programs were protected under the exemption. Food stamps were protected under the exemption. We've seen more people apply for food stamps with the higher rates of unemployment and the increase in the number of discouraged workers. Federal retirement benefits were also exempted from cuts. Child nutrition. There were some tax credits that were also exempted, such as the earned income tax credit. Military pay, it was exempted from sequestration. And then Pell Grants, which affects our students here at community college. Pell Grants, for the most part, were kept in place and still help many of our students here at Community College of Philadelphia afford the opportunity to attend college. So sequestration can have lots of damage on the federal budget and is an issue that can become ugly in our economy. Let's look at what these sequestrations look like when we graph them. Where are the areas of the sequestration cuts? If we look at the graph, what we see is the percent of cuts in all of the non-exempt programs, those that I told you were exempt. We talked about these are the programs that are non-exempt. So if we look at defense, it is experiencing the largest cut. We have a 9.3% cut in spending in defense. It's followed by non-defense discretionary spending. These are items that Congress actually gets to vote on, where we spend our dollars in the federal budget. These are called discretionary spending items that are not attributable to the defense industry. The other area that has a large amount is other mandatory spending. There are areas where the federal government must meet its obligations, such as Social Security. And so there is some exemption from Social Security itself, but in some of the other mandatory areas, we see that they're being cut, which includes some social programs, and they've experienced some large cuts up to 8.2%. We see that Medicare has been capped, and so the cuts to Medicare is only 2%. As we have increasing number of individuals being eligible for Medicare, we need to increase the amount of revenues that we have to fund those Medicare expenses, which is one of the ugly issues that our economy faces. If we look at the sequestration in numbers, what we see is that the 9% in defense spending really equates to about $54 billion every year. Remember, we're trying to cut out a little over $107 billion in each of the years for about 10 years, going from 2013 to 2021. In 2013, there's going to be $38.6 billion of discretionary programs that are cut. The cuts range from anywhere between 7.8% and 10%. So we've heard some of the cuts affect certain areas more than others. One of the more interesting areas is federal funds that go towards providing support for those individuals who can't afford an attorney. So if you can't afford an attorney, you actually have a court-appointed attorney. This area has been cut dramatically, and what that means is that the caseload for federal defense lawyers has actually increased, where they may have had slightly over 100 cases to 150 cases. In some estimates, they're going to have over 500 cases. And what this means is that those individuals who can ill afford an attorney actually will have even lesser representation in the event that they are accused of a federal crime. In 2014 and beyond, appropriations committees will determine cuts. And so the appropriations committees that were formed are actually going to determine what those cuts are going to be, and they will determine how much will happen in defense and how much will happen in non-defense spending. these individuals may not actually get there. What we would hope that would happen in October is that the Congress would come together and have a resolution. The reason that we would hope that the resolution would happen is because in the mandatory spending items and in areas like Medicare, where we have to maintain the level of federal spending, if it isn't done, what that means is that we're going to need more money. And the Treasury is, by virtue of the sequestration, not allowed to send those dollars over. So, of course, what that means is that we'd have to borrow more money. And we've heard about this borrowing through what's called the debt ceiling. In each of the years since we've actually enacted this Sequestration Act, what we've had is a budget resolution that allows for Congress to say, we'll borrow more money in order to fund the spending that the government does that Congress has not appropriated for through these caps. Well, what we've heard is that the debt ceiling will not be raised. And what that means is that some of the obligations of the federal government are going to be in jeopardy. And so when the federal government doesn't pay its bills, what this translates into is a lower credit rating. Kind of works like yourself. You owe someone money and you're late pay or you don't pay the amount that's due. And what that does is it damages your credit. Well, the United States government being having a high credit rating has been allowed to borrow and borrow at very favorable rates in the global market. When our credit rating drops, what that means is not only are we borrowing more, but the amount that we have to pay back will be even more because the interest rate will be higher. So not raising the debt ceiling will be an ugly response if Congress is not able to come to some sort of resolution in the fall of this year. The majority of our cuts that we will experience will happen in discretionary spending, of which that accounts for approximately 70% of all the cuts. Usually those cuts are going to actually impact social programs and what we call the butter in our federal government. So this shows up in programs that help individuals who may be more vulnerable. So individuals who are at the lower part of the economy will experience cuts. I have spoken to people who've seen these cuts that pass down from the federal government, and they impact both states and our local economy. You will remember I talked about stimulus that was paid over to the state of Pennsylvania. Well, those stimulus dollars now go away, which will affect our ability to support at the state level programs that help out the most vulnerable Pennsylvania citizens. When the state has less money, it shows up here in Philadelphia in the form of less funding for programs like public education. We see this in the funding crisis that's here in Philadelphia in the school district of Philadelphia. The majority of cuts happen in this discretionary non-defense spending, and it means that we see it on the ground more. And it leads to some areas in our economy where we have income inequality. Right now, we know that income inequality is at a historic high. Another element of the sequester that we should pay attention to has to relate back to unemployment. Because sequestration will cut funding to federal agencies, a number of federal jobs will actually be eliminated. There are some estimates that if sequestration was allowed to happen in 2013 and in 2014, there would be over 1 million jobs lost over that 2-year period. So although we are adding jobs back, as we're losing jobs, the net effect is a loss to the economy of over 1 million jobs in 2013 and 2014. Unless the private market is able to replace that jobs, what that means is that the unemployment that has been going down will actually go up. And so that would be a sign that we're moving back in the wrong direction. So when we think about where we've come in terms of the recovery, we've shown a lot of good signs. We've had positive GDP. Our GDP has gone up, and we've seen quarter after quarter where GDP has increased. But at the same time, we now know that GDP has not increased at the rate that we'd actually like to see in our economy for us to think of our recovery as a good and positive recovery. And so that's bad. We have good GDP, but not at the pace that we want. When we think about unemployment, we know that the unemployment rate has dropped, but the number of discouraged workers has also increased. And so that means that we have productivity that's left on the sidelines. When our labor force is up and running, that means our unemployment rate is down. That means that we're able to increase GDP because when people are in jobs, we produce more for our economy, more goods are produced, we have a higher quality of life, and there are more goods available for us to purchase. When our unemployment rate actually goes up, that means that there are less people who are working, less consumer spending. That means jobs get eliminated. Employers tend not to hire during these times, and so we could find ourselves going back into a period of recession. I don't think we're there yet, but it is one of the ugly truths of the direction that we face if Congress doesn't resolve some of these issues with our federal government coming in the fall. So when we think about how our revenues and our outlays have differed over time, we know that this is probably one of the biggest issues facing our federal government. How do we narrow the government deficit, which has continued to grow and accumulate over time? Our cumulative deficit is now equal to our overall GDP, which is an ugly sign in the economy. And so for most people, this deficit is the greatest concern and the thing that drives the opposition to within the parties in Congress. And the thing that really is the catalyst for why sequestration happened in the first place. What we hope to know is that as we enter into the fall, Congress will actually look to resolve it. There is a super committee that was formed that has made some recommendations to Congress, but as we can see, there has been a lot of opposition that you hear in the news about the best direction to take. If we don't increase taxes, although some of the tax proposals, at least the one that has been proposed by the president, actually looks to tax higher incomes, there are those who say that when you tax higher incomes, you're actually taxing those individuals who help to create jobs. There are others who say that we shouldn't be looking at just taxing those individuals. We should be looking at discretionary income. Remember, I showed you in the past that discretionary income is the amount of income that an individual has minus the amount of taxes that they pay. We do know that the highest income earners have a low income tax effective rate because a good majority of their income is actually derived from unearned income that happens in the stock market. So as we see the stock market has risen over the past 5 years, their income and their wealth has increased, yet their tax bite has not. So one proposal is to actually increase the tax on the highest income earners here in the United States as one mechanism to increase the amount of receipts and narrow the deficit. Opposition exists. There are a lot of persons who look at supply side economic theory and say tax increases at any point in the economy is bad for the economy and will slow down our GDP. When it comes to outlays, there are those who say we have to make cuts. And so these cuts are in some cases draconian when we think about issues that affect children, issue that affects early childhood education, public education. But there are others who say these are necessary cuts and that we have to make the sacrifices in order for us to actually reduce this deficit. They warn of a looming deficit as being one of the things that could undo our economy. So when we think about the good, which is positive economic indicators in our economy, and the bad, the unintended consequences of some of these good indicators, we often have to consider now the ugly. And the ugly is sequestration. And sequestration is now and it is here. And we would like to see sequestration go away because Congress has acted. What we do know is that our economy does work when we all work. And so that would be the goal. So we hope that Congress will get its act together this fall. And what I'd like to talk to you about in our next lecture is the debt ceiling, because that's another issue that represents an ugly conversation that we have to have about our economy. I'd like to thank you for tuning in today, It's been a pleasure, as always. Remember that our economy works when you do. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us here at the college. We look forward to questions, and we actually pay attention to them. And any comments that you may have are also welcome as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.